I'm Marcus Chen, 47, and for most of my life, I've been the family disappointment. At last month's Thanksgiving dinner, my sister Linda's laughter cut through the room like a blade when I mentioned my little tech company. Still playing with computers, Marcus, she said, her voice dripping with the same condescension I'd heard for decades. When are you going to get a real job? The whole family joined in, my parents nodding knowingly, my brother-in-law smirking behind his wine glass. They saw a middle-aged man in jeans and a worn sweater, still chasing dreams while they had real careers, mortgages, and social status. What they didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I'd received a call that would change everything. My company, the one they'd mocked for years, had just been valued at $2.3 billion. The Fortune 500 list would be published in 2 weeks, and my name would be on it. But the real shock wasn't my success, it was what I discovered about my family's finances, and why they'd worked so hard to keep me small. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, this story is for you. The dismissal wasn't new. It had been the soundtrack of my childhood, a constant hum of disapproval that shaped how I saw myself for decades. I was 8 when I brought home my first report card straight A's across the board. I remember the pride swelling in my chest as I handed it to my father, expecting praise, maybe even a smile. Instead, he glanced at it, scribbled something in the margin, and tossed it back. "Grades don't pay bills, Marcus," he said, not looking up from his newspaper. "Your sister Linda knows that. She's already talking about practical careers, nursing, teaching, real jobs." That report card still sits in my desk drawer, his dismissive words still visible in faded ink. It became a symbol of everything I'd spent my life trying to prove wrong. Linda was 3 years older, and from the beginning, she understood the family currency better than I did. She chose nursing not because she loved helping people, though she was good at it, but because it impressed our parents. Stable, respectable, safe, everything. I apparently wasn't, while Linda earned praise for her practical choices. I spent hours in my room taking apart radios, building crude computers from spare parts, dreaming of technologies that didn't exist yet. My parents saw this as further evidence of my impracticality. "He's got his head in the clouds," my mother would tell relatives, shaking her head with that familiar mixture of disappointment and resigned concern. The pattern continued through high school. Linda's achievements were celebrated homecoming, court, nursing school acceptance, her engagement to Richard. My achievements were met with polite indifference or outright skepticism. When I won the state science fair, my father's response was, "That's nice, but what's it worth in the real world?" Even when I got into MIT on a full scholarship, the family's reaction was muted. "It's just more school," my mother said. "Linda's already working, contributing to society." The implication was clear. I was still playing games while Linda was living in the real world. The day I decided to start my own company, I was 26 and fresh out of graduate school. I had a solid job offer from a major tech firm, but I could see the future in ways they couldn't. I wanted to build something that would change how people interacted with technology, make it more intuitive, more human. When I told my family about my decision to turn down the corporate job and start my own company, the response was predictable. "You're throwing away security for a fantasy?" my father said. Linda was more direct. "You're being selfish, Marcus. Mom and Dad are getting older. They need to know their children are stable." That was 15 years ago. 15 years of building something remarkable while my family treated it like an extended phase I'd eventually outgrow. Even as the company grew, even as we landed major contracts and hired hundreds of employees, they dismissed it as Marcus playing with computers. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they criticized my impractical choices, I was building something that would eventually support all of them whether they knew it or not. Starting a company in your garage sounds romantic until you're living it. The reality was brutal in our days. Ramen noodles for dinner, and the constant hum of doubt that maybe my family was right. I'd converted half of my small garage into a makeshift office, the other half still housing my ancient Honda Civic. The first business plan was scrawled on notebook paper because I couldn't afford proper stationery. The vision was clear in my mind. Intuitive software that would bridge the gap between complex technology and everyday users. I wanted to democratize innovation, make powerful tools accessible to everyone. Those early days were defined by rejection. Investors would listen politely to my pitch, then explain why my idea wouldn't work. "The market isn't ready," they'd say. "People don't want technology to be easier, they want it to be more powerful." They were wrong, but I had no way to prove it yet. My family's reaction to my struggles was predictable. Every Sunday dinner became an intervention. "You could still take that corporate job," my mother would say, passing the potatoes with the same motion she'd used to pass judgment my entire life. "It's not too late to be sensible." Linda was less subtle. "You're 31, Marcus. When are you going to grow up?" She'd just bought her first house with Richard, a beautiful colonial in the suburbs. "This is what success looks like," she'd say, gesturing around their pristine dining room. "Not whatever you're doing in that garage." The breakthrough came in year 3, during one of the darkest periods. I was down to my last few $1,000s, seriously considering whether my family had been right all along. Then I got a call from Sarah Martinez, a small business owner in Arizona who'd somehow found our beta software online. I don't know much about technology, she said, but your program just saved my business. I can track my inventory, manage my customers, handle my accounting all in one place, and I actually understand how to use it. That call changed everything. Sarah wasn't just a customer, she was proof that my vision was right. People didn't need more complex technology, they needed technology that understood them. Word spread through small business networks. We weren't getting venture capital, but we were getting something better. Real customers who genuinely needed what we were building. By year 5, we had 50,000 users. By year 7, we'd hit our first $1 million in revenue. I kept it quiet. Success felt fragile, and I'd learned that sharing good news with my family often resulted in them finding ways to diminish it. When Linda asked about the company at family gatherings, I'd say it was doing okay or keeping me busy. The truth was, we were revolutionizing how small businesses operated, but I wasn't ready to face their skepticism about something that had become so important to me. The decision to stay silent wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about protecting the work. My team didn't need to hear my family's doubts, and our customers didn't need to know their CEO was still fighting for basic respect at Sunday dinner. But every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every suggestion that I needed to get serious about my life, it all became fuel. I was building something remarkable, not in spite of their doubt, but because of it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 days before that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on my office door. Marcus, there's a call from Goldman Sachs. They say it's urgent. I'd been expecting this call for weeks. We'd been in preliminary discussions about a potential acquisition, but nothing had prepared me for what David Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, was about to tell me. Marcus, I hope you're sitting down, David said, his voice carrying the weight of numbers that would change everything. The valuation team has finished their analysis. Based on your user base growth, revenue projections, and market position, we're looking at a company worth $2.3 billion. The words hit me like a physical force. $2.3 billion. I'd known the company was valuable, but hearing that number made it real in a way that quarterly reports never could. Furthermore, David continued, Fortune has confirmed your placement on their Fortune 500 list. You'll be number 247. The announcement goes public in 2 weeks. After I hung up, I sat in my office for nearly an hour, staring out the window at the San Francisco skyline. The garage where I'd started this journey was just 12 miles away, but it felt like a different lifetime. I thought about that first business plan written on notebook paper, about Sarah Martinez's life-changing phone call, about every family dinner where I'd been made to feel like a failure. The irony was overwhelming. While my family had spent years treating me like an impractical dreamer, I'd built something that would put me among the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. The little tech company they'd mocked was now worth more than most Fortune 500 companies. But the victory felt hollow without anyone to share it with. My team knew, of course, and they were ecstatic. We'd built something extraordinary together. But the people whose approval I'd craved my entire life, they had no idea what I'd accomplished. I could have called them immediately, could have driven to my parents' house and shared the news, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every suggestion that I needed to get real about my life. Maybe it was the knowledge that their reaction would somehow diminish this moment. Instead, I made a different choice. I would wait. The Fortune 500 announcement would be public in 2 weeks. Let them discover it the way the rest of the world would let them see my name in print, my company's valuation in black and white, before they had a chance to question it or explain it away. The next 2 weeks were surreal. I moved through family interactions knowing something they didn't, seeing their condescension through a completely different lens. When Linda made her comment about my little tech company at Thanksgiving, I almost laughed. Little if only she knew that my little company was worth more than the GDP of some small countries, but I kept quiet. I smiled, nodded, and let them maintain their illusions for just a little longer, because I'd learned something important during those years of building in silence. Sometimes the most powerful response to doubt isn't argument, it's achievement. The morning Fortune published their list, I was ready. Not for revenge, exactly, but for a conversation that was 15 years overdue. My family was about to learn who I really was, and more importantly, who I'd become despite their doubts. The boy who'd been dismissed for dreaming too big had grown into a man who'd made those dreams reality. And that reality was about to reshape everything they thought they knew about success, about family, and about the son and brother they'd never quite understood. Linda's life, at least from the outside, was everything my parents had wanted for their children. She lived in a 6-bedroom colonial in an exclusive suburb, drove a luxury SUV, and her social media was a carefully curated showcase of success. Her Instagram feed was full of perfectly staged photos, elaborate dinner parties, expensive vacations, designer handbags casually positioned in the background of candid shots, but I'd begun to notice cracks in the facade. It started with small things. The way Richard's smile never quite reached his eyes during family gatherings. How Linda would quickly change the subject when anyone asked about his work at the investment firm. The designer handbags were always last season's, I realized, and their European vacation photos had a generic quality that made me wonder if they were stock images. The colonial house was impressive from the street, but during family gatherings, I noticed details that didn't add up. The furniture was beautiful, but clearly rented. I could see the tiny rental company tags if you knew where to look. The artwork was prints, not originals, despite Linda's casual references to our collection. What really caught my attention was her reaction to my success. Most people, even family members who'd been dismissive, would show some curiosity when they learned about a major achievement. But Linda's response to any mention of my company was immediate deflection followed by aggressive diminishment. "Oh, Marcus and his computer games?" she'd say, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm sure it's very complicated, but Richard deals with real money. Millions of dollars change hands in his deals every day." The more successful my company became, the more elaborate Linda's displays of wealth grew. It was as if she sensed something shifting and needed to establish her dominance before the family hierarchy could change. Richard was easier to read. He'd been riding high on the financial sector boom for years, making aggressive investments and leveraging every asset he could find. His confidence was infectious. He'd hold court at family dinners, explaining complex financial instruments and market strategies with the kind of certainty that impressed my parents. "Marcus, you should let me manage your company's finances," he'd say, not knowing that our finance team was already handling more money than he'd ever seen. "I could triple your returns in 6 months," but I'd started paying attention to the details. The way he'd check his phone constantly, the stress, lines around his eyes, the fact that he always steered conversations away from specific numbers. When he talked about his big deals, they were always vague, always in progress, always about to close. Linda's jealousy was more subtle but equally revealing. She'd built her identity around being the successful sibling, the one who'd made practical choices and achieved real-world results. My continued pursuit of what she saw as an impractical dream threatened that narrative. The more I watched, the more I realized that Linda's perfect life was a performance designed to maintain her position in the family hierarchy. She needed to be seen as the successful one, the responsible one, the child who'd justified our parents' faith in practical choices. What I didn't understand yet was how desperate that performance had become. Linda wasn't just trying to outshine me, she was trying to hide a financial catastrophe that threatened everything she'd built. The designer lifestyle, the expensive house, the carefully curated social media presence, it was all funded by debt that was spiraling out of control. But I would learn soon enough. The Fortune 500 announcement would force more than just a reckoning with my own success. It would expose the truth about Linda's carefully constructed facade and reveal just how much my family's dismissal of me had been motivated by their own insecurities and failures. For now, though I watched and waited, Linda's perfect life was about to collide with reality, and I was curious to see how she'd handle it when she could no longer dismiss me as the family failure. The truth about my family's financial dynamics came to light through an unexpected source. My mother's casual comment about updating their will. "We're meeting with the estate attorney next week," she mentioned during one of our regular phone calls. "Linda's been helping us review everything. She's so good with financial planning." That comment nagged at me. Why was Linda involved in their estate planning? As the older child, it made some sense. But my parents had always insisted on handling their own affairs. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to do some research. What I discovered was more troubling than I'd expected. Through public records and some careful inquiries, I learned that my parents' estate planning had been heavily influenced by Linda's advice over the past 5 years. The family trust had been restructured in ways that heavily favored her, both in terms of immediate access to funds and eventual inheritance distribution. More concerning was the pattern of financial dependency I uncovered. Linda had been receiving regular loans from my parents, substantial amounts that were never repaid. These weren't documented as gifts, which would have triggered tax implications, but as loans with conveniently flexible repayment terms. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Linda had positioned herself as the family's financial advisor. Despite having no formal training in estate planning or investment management, she'd convinced my parents that her nursing career gave her practical insights into planning for healthcare costs and retirement needs. Meanwhile, Richard had been using his supposed expertise to guide my parents' investment decisions. Their retirement portfolio had been restructured multiple times based on his recommendations, each time moving money into more aggressive, higher-risk investments that coincidentally aligned with his own financial strategies. The most revealing discovery was a series of loans my parents had co-signed for Linda and Richard's real estate investments. They'd put their own home up as collateral for investment properties that Richard claimed would generate substantial returns. Properties that, according to county records, were now in various stages of financial distress. I realized that my exclusion from family financial discussions hadn't been accidental, it had been strategic. Linda couldn't risk having someone with actual business experience examining their arrangements too closely. My supposed lack of practical financial sense had been a convenient excuse to keep me out of conversations where I might have asked uncomfortable questions. The irony was staggering. While they'd dismissed my company as impractical and financially risky, they'd been making genuinely reckless financial decisions, based on Richard's overconfidence and Linda's need to maintain her position as the family's financial leader. My parents, meanwhile, had been slowly depleting their retirement savings to support Linda's lifestyle while believing they were investing in their family's future. They trusted Linda's judgment completely, seeing her practical nursing career as evidence of her financial wisdom. The pattern extended beyond money. Family decisions were increasingly filtered through Linda's opinions: where to spend holidays, which family traditions to maintain, how to handle my parents' aging needs. Linda had gradually positioned herself as the family decision-maker, with Richard providing the supposed financial expertise to back up her recommendations. What disturbed me most was realizing how systematically I'd been excluded from this process. Every family gathering where I'd felt like an outsider, every financial conversation that stopped when I entered the room, every dismissive comment about my impractical career, had all served to maintain a system where Linda controlled the family narrative. The Fortune 500 announcement would shatter that carefully constructed dynamic. Once my actual financial success became public, the family would have to confront the reality that they'd been taking advice from people who were secretly struggling, while ignoring the one family member who'd achieved genuine financial success. I wasn't angry. Exactly, I was sad. Sad that my family had built their security on such a fragile foundation, and sad that their need to keep me small had prevented them from benefiting from my actual expertise when they might have needed it most. The Fortune 500 list was published on a crisp Monday morning in November. I had woken up early, not from anxiety but from anticipation. After 15 years of building something extraordinary while being treated like the family failure, this moment felt like vindication in its purest form. I picked up my copy of Fortune magazine from the newsstand myself. I wanted the physical magazine, the tangible proof of what I'd accomplished. There it was, on page 47, Chen Technologies, number 247, $2.3 billion valuation. My company's name in black and white, my achievement, impossible to dismiss or diminish. The online version had gone live at 6 a.m. Eastern. By 7 a.m., my phone was buzzing with congratulations from colleagues, industry contacts, and business partners. The tech press picked up the story quickly. Several outlets ran features about overnight success stories, though anyone who'd been paying attention knew this had been 15 years in the making. I sat in my office that morning, reading the coverage and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated pride. No family members questioning my choices, no dismissive comments about practicality, no suggestions that I needed to get serious about my life. Just recognition for what I'd actually built. My assistant knocked on the door around 10 a.m. "Marcus, your phone's been ringing nonstop. Should I start taking messages? Who's calling?" Lots of media requests, some investor inquiries, and she paused, checking her notes. "Several calls from family members. Your sister has called 4 times. I smiled. Linda had called 4 times. The sister who'd spent years dismissing my work as playing with computers had now called 4 times in 3 hours. I could only imagine what those conversations were like. "Take messages from everyone except immediate family," I said. "I'll call them back when I'm ready." The truth was, I wasn't sure when I'd be ready. This moment belonged to me and my team. We'd worked too hard and overcome too much to have it immediately complicated by family drama and sudden interest from people who'd never supported the journey. Around noon, I decided to check social media. The Fortune article had been shared widely, and I was curious to see if any family members had posted about it. Sure enough, Linda had shared the article on Facebook with the comment, "So proud of my little brother's success. Always knew he had it in him, always knew." The phrase made me laugh out loud. Linda had spent the better part of 2 decades explaining to anyone who'd listen why my career choices were impractical and my business ventures were doomed to fail. But now, with my success impossible to ignore, she'd always known. Richard had posted something similar. "Congratulations to my brilliant brother-in-law. Family pride." This from the man who'd regularly suggested I let him manage my company's finances because I obviously didn't understand real money. My parents hadn't posted anything yet, but I imagined they were fielding questions from friends and neighbors who'd seen the news. For years, they'd explained my career as a phase I'd eventually outgrow. Now they'd have to explain why they'd never mentioned that their son was building a billion-dollar company. The most surreal part was the sudden stream of LinkedIn connection requests from extended family members I hadn't heard from in years. Cousins who'd never responded to my messages, family friends who'd politely ignored my work suddenly. Everyone wanted to connect with me professionally. By late afternoon, I'd decided how to handle the family situation. I wouldn't return the calls immediately. I'd let them sit with this new reality for a while, let them process what they'd missed and why they'd missed it. Tomorrow, I'd start having conversations. but today belonged to celebrating an achievement that had nothing to do with their approval or disapproval. That I left the office that evening, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely free from the need to prove myself to my family. The proof was now public record, impossible to dismiss or diminish. The boy who'd been told his dreams were impractical had just been recognized as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America. The validation was complete, and it was time to decide what to do with it. Richard's first text came at 11:47 p.m. on the day the fortune list was published. I was at home, finally allowing myself to relax after a day of media interviews and congratulatory calls, when my phone buzzed. Marcus just saw the fortune news. Incredible achievement. Would love to chat about some investment opportunities when you have time. Investment opportunities, not congratulations on 15 years of hard work, not acknowledgement of what I'd built, but immediately pivoting to how he could benefit from my success. More texts followed over the next few days, each one more desperate than the last. Hey, no, you're probably swamped, but I've got some time-sensitive deals that could be perfect for diversifying your portfolio. Marcus tried calling but went to voicemail. These opportunities won't wait. Thought you'd want first crack at them. Not sure if you're getting my messages. Call me ASAP. This could be huge for both of us. The escalation was fascinating to watch. Richard, who'd spent years condescending to me about money and business, was now frantically trying to position himself as an essential partner in my financial future. The desperation in his messages revealed more about his situation than he probably intended. I decided to do some research. Before responding, what I discovered was worse than I'd suspected. Richard's investment firm was on the verge of collapse. His aggressive trading strategies, which had worked during the market boom, had turned catastrophic when conditions changed. He'd been doubling down on failing positions, borrowing against everything he owned to cover mounting losses. The beautiful colonial house Linda was so proud of was mortgaged to the maximum. Their investment properties, the ones my parents had co-signed for, were hemorrhaging money. Richard had been using client funds to cover personal losses, a practice that was not only unethical but potentially criminal. More troubling was what I learned about his gambling. It wasn't just poor investment decisions. Richard had a genuine addiction to high-stakes betting. Casino records, obtained through a private investigator I'd hired, showed regular losses in the tens of thousands. He'd been funding this habit through increasingly risky financial maneuvers, each one digging him deeper into a hole he couldn't escape. The most revealing discovery was a series of loan applications he'd filed over the past 6 months. Every major bank had turned him down. His credit was destroyed, his assets were over, and his income had essentially disappeared as his client base fled. When he called me, directly, his first actual phone call rather than text, desperation was audible in his voice. Marcus, thank God you picked up. Listen, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye about business, but I think I misjudged your potential. This fortune thing is incredible, really incredible. Thank you, Richard. The thing is, I've got some opportunities that are absolutely perfect for someone in your position. High-yield, low-risky investments that could triple your money in 6 months. But they require immediate action. What kind of opportunities? Well, they're complex financial instruments, derivatives mostly. I know they sound complicated, but trust me, I've been doing this for 20 years. I could manage everything for you, take care of all the details. The irony was painful. Richard was asking me to trust him with my money, while his own financial world was collapsing around him. He was so desperate that he was pitching the same risky strategies that had destroyed his own portfolio. How much are we talking about? I asked, curious to see how far he'd push. Well, for these particular opportunities, we'd want to start with at least 10 million, maybe 20 if you're feeling aggressive. I know it sounds like a lot, but when you're playing at this level, you need to think big. $10 to $20 million. He was asking me to risk more money than he'd ever legitimately managed, based on strategies that had already bankrupted him. The desperation was staggering. I'll think about it, I said. Marcus, I really can't stress this enough. These opportunities won't be available long. If you wait, we'll lose out to other investors. I understand, I'll get back to you. After I hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about the conversation. Richard wasn't just desperate for money, he was desperate to maintain the illusion that he was still a successful financial advisor. Admitting his failures would mean acknowledging that his condescending attitude toward my career had been built on nothing but arrogance and ignorance. The saddest part was that Richard genuinely seemed to believe his own pitch. He was so deep in denial about his situation that he thought he could solve everything with one big score, funded by the family member he'd spent years dismissing as financially naive. I wasn't angry with Richard, I pitied him, but I was angry about what his desperation meant for my family. My parents, Linda, everyone who'd been depending on his supposed expertise, was about to discover just how badly they'd been misled. The deeper I investigated my family's financial situation, the more horrifying it became. What I'd initially assumed was simple overspending turned out to be a systematic dismantling of 3 generations of financial security. It started with the foreclosure notice I discovered through public records. Linda and Richard's beautiful colonial, the house that had symbolized their success for the past 7 years, was 90 days away from foreclosure. They owed more than $800,000 on a property now worth less than $600,000 thanks to Richard's decision to repeatedly refinance and extract equity for his failed investments. But that was just the beginning. The investment properties my parents had co-signed for were all in default. Richard had convinced them that real estate was the safest investment possible, that rental income would cover the mortgages while building long-term wealth. Instead, the properties had been bleeding money from day one: high vacancy rates, expensive repairs, and mortgage payments that exceeded rental income by thousands each month. My parents' retirement savings had been systematically depleted to cover these losses. Their 401k had been cashed out early, triggering massive tax penalties. Their pension had been borrowed against. Even their life insurance policies had been converted to cash to feed Richard's increasingly desperate investment schemes. The most devastating discovery was the scope of Richard's gambling debts. Through casino loyalty programs and credit applications, I traced losses exceeding $2 million over the past 3 years. He'd been flying to Las Vegas twice a month, staying in high-roller suites, and betting amounts that would have been reckless even if he'd been winning. To fund this addiction, Richard had been systematically stealing from everyone around him. Client accounts had been raided, with funds moved to cover gambling losses before being replaced with money from new clients, a classic Ponzi scheme that was now collapsing as his client base evaporated. Even more personally devastating was what he'd stolen from Linda. Her nursing salary, which she'd carefully saved for years, had been invested in Richard's schemes without her knowledge. The retirement account she'd built over 2 decades was gone, transferred to cover margin calls on failed trades. Linda herself was drowning in credit card debt, desperately trying to maintain their lifestyle while having no idea how dire their financial situation had become. Richard had been hiding the worst of it from her, forging financial statements and intercepting mail to prevent her from seeing foreclosure notices and collection letters. The designer lifestyle that had made Linda feel superior to my impractical career was being funded entirely by debt. The luxury SUV was leased at rates that would have been criminal if they weren't technically legal. The designer clothes were purchased with credit cards that were already maxed out. Even the elaborate dinner parties she'd hosted to showcase their success had been funded by cash advances. My parents were perhaps the most tragic victims of this financial catastrophe. They'd trusted Richard's expertise completely, believing that his confident explanations of complex financial instruments proved his competence. When he suggested they remortgage their paid-off home to fund investment opportunities, they'd agreed because they trusted their son-in-law's financial acumen. Now their home, the house they'd lived in for 30 years, the place where they'd raised their children, was at risk. They owed more than it was worth, and their fixed income couldn't cover the new mortgage payments Richard had convinced them to take on. The cruelest irony was that while Richard was destroying everyone's financial security through his gambling and failed investments, he'd consistently dismissed my company as too risky. He'd actually counseled my parents against investing in my business during the early years, claiming that technology startups were inherently unstable. As I compiled this devastating financial picture, I realized that my family's dismissal of my career hadn't just been about their preference for practical choices, it had been about maintaining Richard's position as the family's financial authority. Acknowledging my business expertise would have threatened his ability to continue the systematic looting of everyone's assets. The house of cards was about to collapse completely. Foreclosure proceedings were advancing, creditors were circling, and Richard's remaining clients were asking questions he couldn't answer. Within months, my family would lose everything they'd built over decades: their homes, their savings, their financial security, and through it all, they'd continued to treat me like the family failure, the impractical dreamer who needed to get serious about money. The irony was so complete it would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. The Fortune 500 announcement hadn't just revealed my success, it had exposed the magnitude of their failures. Soon, very soon, they would need help from the one family member they'd spent years dismissing as financially irresponsible. The call from my mother came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the Fortune announcement. Her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before, not the confident authority that had shaped my childhood, but something fragile and uncertain. "Marcus, honey, could you come over this weekend? Your father and I would like to talk to you about something important." The timing wasn't coincidental. I'd been expecting this conversation since discovering the extent of their financial crisis. What I hadn't expected was how difficult it would be to hear the fear in my mother's voice. When I arrived at their house on Saturday afternoon, the changes were immediately visible. The lawn that my father had always maintained meticulously was overgrown, the front steps needed repair, even the mailbox was askew. Small signs of a household under stress. My parents looked older than their ages, worn down by worry and the crushing weight of financial decisions they didn't fully understand. My father, who'd always projected confidence, about money and practical matters. Couldn't meet my eyes when I sat down across from them in their living room. We've been following the news about your company, my mother began carefully. We're very proud of what you've accomplished. The words felt hollow, scripted. We all knew they were trying to rebuild a bridge they'd spent years burning down. Thank you, I said simply. My father cleared his throat. Son, we owe you an apology. We may have been too quick to dismiss your career choices over the years. We didn't understand what you were building. This was as close to an admission of error as I was likely to get from him. The man who'd written grades don't pay bills on my report card was acknowledging that he'd been wrong about my potential. We're having some financial difficulties, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard has been helping us with investments, but some of them haven't worked out the way we expected. Some of them hadn't worked out. It was such a massive understatement that I almost laughed. Their entire financial foundation had been destroyed, not by bad luck but by Richard's systematic incompetence and fraud. How bad is it? I asked gently. My father handed me a stack of papers, medical bills, mortgage statements, loan documents. The picture was even worse than my private investigation had revealed. They owed more than $300,000 in medical expenses from my father's recent heart surgery. The insurance had covered less than expected, and they'd been paying the bills with credit cards at 20% interest at the house they'd owned free and clear for 15 years was now mortgaged to the maximum. Richard had convinced them to use their equity to fund real estate investments that were supposed to generate income for their retirement. Instead, they were paying mortgages on 3 properties that were losing money every month. We trusted Richard's expertise, my mother said, tears starting to form. He seemed so knowledgeable about finance. We thought we were securing our future. The tragedy wasn't just the money they'd lost, it was how completely they'd been manipulated. Richard had used their trust in his supposed expertise to gain access to assets they'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Their retirement savings, their home equity, even their life insurance policies had been converted to cash and fed into his failing schemes. Richard says the investments just need more time to mature, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. He's confident they'll turn around. I could see they were still hoping, still clinging to the belief that Richard's confidence was based on genuine expertise rather than desperate denial. They couldn't face the reality that they'd been systematically robbed by their own son-in-law. Mom, Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did you ever consider asking for my advice about these investments? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Finally, my mother spoke. We thought we assumed you were too busy with your computer work to understand real estate and traditional investments. Richard made it all sound so complex, so professional. They'd trusted Richard's financial advice over mine not because of his track record or expertise, but because they'd never seen my work as real business. Even as my company grew and succeeded, they'd maintained the fiction that I was playing with toys while Richard dealt with serious money. The irony was devastating. While they'd been dismissing my business expertise, I'd been building something worth billions. While they'd been trusting Richard's supposed financial acumen, he'd been destroying everything they'd worked for. We know you're successful now, my father said quietly. We're wondering if you might have any advice about our situation. Advice. After decades of dismissing my judgment, they were asking for advice. But I could see in their faces that they still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of either my success or their crisis. They thought this was about getting some helpful tips, not about needing rescue from complete financial collapse. I'll help you, I said simply. But first, we need to have a complete and honest conversation about what's really happening with your finances, and that means talking about Richard. The relief in their faces was heartbreaking. They'd been carrying this burden alone, too proud to ask for help, too embarrassed to admit they'd made terrible decisions. The parents who'd spent my childhood teaching me about responsibility and practical choices had made choices that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. But underneath my sadness was something else. Determination. I wouldn't let Richard's failures destroy my parents' remaining years. They'd spent decades dismissing my capabilities, but now those capabilities were exactly what they needed to survive. The week after my conversation with my parents, I found myself at a crossroads I'd never expected to face. I had the power to save my family from financial ruin, but I also had the opportunity to let them experience the consequences of dismissing me for so many years. The vindictive part of me wanted to watch it all collapse. There was a certain poetic justice in the idea of Linda losing her perfect house, Richard facing criminal charges for his financial fraud, and my parents learning the hard way that practical choices weren't always wise choices. They'd spent decades making me feel like a failure. Why shouldn't they experience some failure themselves? But that wasn't who I wanted to be. Success had taught me something my family had never understood. Real power isn't about revenge. It's about having the strength to choose mercy when you could choose punishment. Still, I wasn't going to simply write checks and pretend nothing had happened. This family needed to confront some hard truths about how they'd treated me, and why. They needed to understand that their dismissal hadn't been based on wisdom or experience, that had been based on fear and insecurity. Linda's 45th birthday party was scheduled for the following Saturday. She'd planned an elaborate celebration at an expensive restaurant. Another attempt to maintain the facade of success, even as her world crumbled around her. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, back when I was still the family disappointment, who might not even attend. The party would be perfect. The whole family would be there. Along with Linda's social circle, the people she'd spent years impressing with stories about her successful life and her impractical younger brother. It would be a controlled environment where she couldn't simply hang up the phone or storm out of the room. I spent hours planning exactly what I would say. This wasn't about humiliating Linda or my parents. It was about establishing a new dynamic, based on honesty rather than delusion. They needed to understand that their dismissal of me hadn't been protective, or wise, it had been destructive to everyone involved. My approach would be methodical. First, I'd let them reveal their financial situation themselves. Richard's desperation would make that inevitable. He'd probably approach me at the party with some new investment scheme, giving me the perfect opening to discuss real financial planning. Then I'd present the facts, not with anger or accusation, but with the same calm professionalism I used in boardroom presentations. Numbers don't lie, and the numbers would tell a story that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Finally, I'd offer help, but with conditions. I wouldn't simply rescue them from their mistakes. I'd help them build something sustainable, but only if they were willing to acknowledge how they'd gotten into this situation and commit to making better choices going forward. The key was maintaining my composure throughout. I'd spent too many years letting their dismissal make me emotional, defensive, reactive. This time, I would be the steady presence in the room. I would be the adult who understood money, business, and long-term planning, everything they'd always claimed I lacked. Part of me was nervous about the confrontation. Despite everything, these were still my parents, still my sister. I didn't want to destroy our relationships. I wanted to rebuild them on a foundation of mutual respect rather than condescension and denial. But another part of me was excited. For the first time in my adult life, I would enter a family gathering from a position of genuine strength. Not the defensive strength of someone trying to prove themselves, but the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The boy who'd been told his dreams were impractical was about to have a very practical conversation about money, responsibility, and the real-world consequences of poor decision-making. It would be a conversation 15 years in the making, and it would change our family dynamics forever. Linda's birthday party was everything I'd expected: and expensive display designed to maintain appearances while the foundation crumbled underneath. The restaurant was upscale, the flowers elaborate, the wine list carefully curated to impress. What Linda's guests didn't know was that the entire celebration was being funded by matched-out credit cards and borrowed money. I arrived fashionably late, walking into a room full of Linda's nursing colleagues, neighborhood friends, and family members who hadn't seen me since the fortune announcement. The change in how people greeted me was immediate and uncomfortable. Where I'd once been ignored or politely dismissed, now everyone wanted to shake my hand and congratulate me on my overnight success. Linda looked stunning in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was holding court near the bar, accepting congratulations and gifts with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years cultivating an image of effortless success. Marcus, she called out when she saw me, her voice carrying just a hint of the old condescension mixed with new uncertainty. "I'm so glad you could make it. Everyone's been asking about your Big Fortune magazine feature." The conversation around us quieted as people tuned in to hear how the newly famous brother would respond to his successful sister. It was perfect, exactly the audience I'd hoped for. "Happy birthday, Linda," I said, handing her a beautifully wrapped gift. 45. "Looks good on you." "Thank you. You know, I've been telling everyone how proud I am of your little computer company making it so big." Who would have thought? There it was again. Little computer company. Even now, even with my success impossible to deny, she couldn't resist diminishing it. The condescension was automatic, a reflex she couldn't control. "It's been quite a journey," I agreed calmly. "Speaking of success, how are your investments?" And Richard was telling me about some exciting opportunities he wanted to discuss. Linda's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, Richard's always working on something new. You know how the financial world is so complex, so moving?" Richard appeared at her elbow as if summoned, his face showing the strain of someone trying to maintain composure under enormous pressure. His suit was expensive but showed signs of wear, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wine glass. "Marcus, great to see you. Have you given any thought to those investment opportunities we discussed?" The room was listening now, curious about what financial wisdom the successful investment advisor would share with the newly wealthy tech entrepreneur. Richard was performing for an audience, trying to maintain his image as the family's financial expert. "Actually, Richard, I've been doing some research into investment strategies," I said, my voice carrying easily across the room. "I'm particularly interested in risk management and the importance of diversification. Tell me, what's your philosophy on leveraging residential real estate for speculative investments?" Richard's face went pale. The specific nature of my question told him I knew more than I was letting on. "Well, real estate is always a solid foundation for any portfolio, even when the properties are in foreclosure." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. The conversations around us stopped completely. Linda looked confused, Richard looked trapped, and my parents, who had just joined our circle, looked terrified. "I'm sorry, what?" Linda asked, her voice smaller now. I said, "Even when the properties are in foreclosure, it's a relevant question, isn't it, Richard? Given that 3 properties my parents co-signed for are currently in default." The circle around us had grown, as people sensed drama unfolding. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Linda was staring at him, pieces starting to connect in her mind. "Richard, what is he talking about?" she asked. "Linda, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," I said firmly. "We've had enough private conversations in this family. It's time for some transparency." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folder of documents I'd prepared. "These are public records," I said, speaking to the room as much as to my family. "Foreclosure notices, bankruptcy filings, SEC investigations, all involving Richard's investment firm and its clients, including our family." Linda grabbed the folder, her hands shaking as she flipped through pages of legal documents. I watched her face change as she recognized addresses, saw amounts, understood the scope of what had been hidden from her. "Your beautiful house, Linda, 90 days from foreclosure. Your retirement savings gone. Mom and Dad's home, mortgage to fund Richard's gambling debts." "Gambling," Linda whispered. $2 million in casino losses over 3 years. "Would you like to see the receipts?" The room was completely silent now. This wasn't family drama. This was financial catastrophe being exposed in real time. Richard looked like he might faint. My parents were holding on to each other for support. "But you all spent years telling me I was impractical," I continued, my voice still calm and measured. "You said I didn't understand real money, real responsibility. You dismissed my business as playing with computers while you trusted a man who was systematically stealing from everyone who believed in him." Linda was crying now, makeup running down her cheeks as she continued reading through the documents. "Richard, tell me this isn't true. Tell me we're not losing everything." Richard couldn't speak. The weight of his deception, exposed in front of everyone who'd believed in his expertise, had finally broken him. "I can help," I said, and the room seemed to exhale collectively. "I can save the house, pay off the debts, restore the retirement funds, but not until this family acknowledges some very uncomfortable truths about how we got here and why." The transformation in the room was complete. The successful sister's birthday party had become the moment when the family failure became the family savior. The practical choices had led to ruin, while the impractical dream had created the only path to salvation. It wasn't revenge. Exactly. It was justice, and it was long overdue. The aftermath of my revelation at Linda's birthday party was immediate and devastating. The carefully orchestrated celebration dissolved into chaos as guests whispered among themselves and gradually began making excuses to leave. Within 30 minutes, what had started as a party of 40 people was reduced to immediate family members and a few close friends who were too shocked to move. Linda sat in stunned silence, still clutching the folder of documents that detailed the destruction of everything she'd thought was secure. Richard had retreated to the men's room and hadn't returned. I suspected he was calling lawyers or possibly contemplating escape routes. My parents looked aged beyond their years, the weight of their financial crisis now public knowledge among people they'd tried to impress for decades. The dignity they'd worked so hard to maintain was gone, replaced by the raw vulnerability of people who'd discovered they'd been living a lie. "Why didn't you tell me?" Linda finally asked, her voice barely audible. "If you knew all this, why didn't you warn me?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been preparing to answer. "Would you have listened? 6 months ago, if I'd come to you with concerns about Richard's investment strategies, what would you have said?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her replaying years of family interactions in her mind. Every time I'd tried to offer business advice, every suggestion I'd made about financial planning, every attempt to be taken seriously as someone who understood money and markets, "You would have told me I didn't understand real finance," I continued. "You would have said Richard was a professional while I was just playing with computers. You would have dismissed my concerns the same way you've dismissed everything else I've ever said about business. But this is different." "No, Linda, it's not different. This is exactly the same pattern that's been going on for 15 years. You've never respected my judgment about anything related to money or business. Why would financial advice be any exception?" My mother finally spoke up. "Marcus, we know we made mistakes. This isn't about mistakes. Mom, mistakes are accidental. This was systematic dismissal based on prejudice and ignorance. You convinced yourselves that practical choices were always superior to innovative ones, that traditional approaches were always safer than creative ones. You were wrong, and that wrongness nearly destroyed everything you'd worked for." The restaurant manager approached our table carefully. "Excuse me, but we're going to need to close the private dining room soon. We'll take care of the bill," I said, pulling out my personal credit card. It was a small gesture, but symbolically important. The family failure was now paying for the family gathering. After the staff had cleared the room and given us privacy, Richard finally returned from wherever he'd been hiding. His face was pale and his hands were shaken, but he was trying to maintain some semblance of composure. Marcus, I know how this looks, but you have to understand the markets have been volatile, and some investments take time to mature. Stop, I said firmly. Just stop. We're past the point of explanations and excuses. The question now is what happens next. What do you mean? Linda asked. I mean that your financial situation is terminal without immediate intervention. The foreclosure proceedings are advanced, the creditors are circling, and Richard's remaining clients are asking questions he can't answer. Within 60 days, you'll lose everything. The reality hit them like a physical blow. Linda started crying. Again, quiet tears that spoke to years of careful planning and hard work disappearing into nothing. My parents looked shell-shocked, unable to process how completely their financial security had evaporated. But you said you could help, my father said hopefully. I can pay off all the debts, stop the foreclosures, restore the retirement accounts, and provide ongoing financial security for everyone in this family. But I have conditions. What kind of conditions? Richard asked suspiciously. First, Richard, you need professional help for your gambling addiction. Real help, not just promises to stop. Second, you need to turn yourself in to the SEC and cooperate fully with their investigation into your business practices. Richard's face went white. Marcus, you don't understand what you're asking. I understand perfectly. You've committed financial fraud on a massive scale. The choice isn't whether you'll face consequences, it's whether you'll face them with dignity, or wait for the authorities to come find you. And for the rest of us, Linda asked, you need to acknowledge what really happened here. Not just the financial mistakes, but the pattern of dismissal and condescension that made those mistakes possible. You need to understand that success isn't about choosing safe, traditional paths, it's about making informed decisions based on actual knowledge rather than prejudice. The silence stretched for several minutes. I could see them processing not just the financial crisis, but the complete reversal of family dynamics that my offer represented. The person they'd spent years treating as irresponsible was now their only hope for financial survival. If we agree to your conditions, my mother asked carefully, what exactly are you offering? Complete financial security. Houses paid off, debts cleared, retirement funds restored. A trust fund that ensures you'll never have to worry about money again, but managed by professionals I trust, with oversight I control. It was a generous offer, but it was also a fundamental shift in family power. They would be financially dependent on the son and brother they'd never respected, subject to the judgment they'd never trusted. We don't have much choice, do we? Linda said quietly. You always have choices, Linda, but some choices have consequences, and some consequences require help to overcome. The reckoning was complete. The family hierarchy had been permanently inverted, and everyone in the room understood the new reality. The question now was whether they could accept it with grace or would continue fighting a battle they'd already lost. The week following, Linda's birthday party was a masterclass in the psychology of family dynamics under extreme stress. Each family member processed the new reality differently, and their responses revealed more about their character than decades of normal interaction ever had. Richard was the first to break. 2 days after the party, he called me at 3 a.m., sobbing into the phone like a child. Marcus, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just a few bad trades, and then I thought I could win it back, make everyone whole again. His confession lasted nearly an hour. The gambling addiction had started years earlier, triggered by the stress of managing other people's money during volatile market conditions. What began as occasional trips to local casinos had escalated into high-stakes betting that consumed every spare dollar and then some. I kept thinking the next deal would solve everything, he admitted. Just one big score to pay everyone back and get clean. But it never came, and I kept digging deeper. By Thursday, Richard had checked himself into a residential treatment facility for gambling addiction. More importantly, he'd retained a criminal defense attorney and was cooperating with the SEC investigation that had been quietly building for months. The authorities had already been tracking his financial irregularities. My public exposure had simply accelerated their timeline. Linda's response was more complex. The initial shock gave way to a kind of desperate bargaining, as if she could negotiate her way back to the life she'd built. She called me repeatedly, alternating between apologies and attempts to minimize what had happened. I know Richard made mistakes, she said during one particularly difficult conversation, but do we really need to involve lawyers and government agencies? Can't we handle this privately, as a family? Linda, this isn't about family anymore. Richard stole money from clients. That's not a family dispute, it's a federal crime. But what about my reputation? What about my career? When people find out what Richard did, they'll think I was involved. It was revealing that her first concern was social embarrassment rather than the people Richard had hurt. She was still thinking like someone whose primary problem was maintaining appearances, rather than rebuilding from complete financial collapse. My parents' reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking. They'd spent their entire lives building financial security through careful saving and conservative choices, only to see it all disappear because they'd trusted the wrong person's expertise. The guilt was overwhelming them. We should have listened to you, my father said during a family meeting I'd called to discuss the practical steps of financial recovery. All those years we thought we knew better, but we didn't know anything. You knew plenty, I replied. You knew how to work hard, save money, and build something meaningful. Those are valuable skills. You just got bad advice about how to protect what you'd built? But the deeper truth was emerging through our conversations. Their dismissal of my career hadn't just been about preferring practical choices, it had been about fear. Fear that acknowledging my success would reveal their own limitations. Fear that supporting my unconventional path would make them look foolish to their peers. We were embarrassed. My mother admitted during a particularly honest moment when people asked what our son did for a living, we didn't know how to explain it. Technology, computers, software, it all seemed so foreign to us. It was easier to act like it wasn't serious than to admit we didn't understand it. That confession explained so much about our family dynamics. They hadn't been dismissive because they thought I was wrong, they'd been dismissive because they were insecure about not understanding what I was doing. Their condescension had been a defense mechanism against their own feelings of inadequacy. The financial audit I'd commissioned revealed the full scope of the damage. Beyond the obvious losses, the foreclosures, the depleted retirement accounts, the gambling debts, there were layers of financial complexity that would take months to unravel. Richard had been juggling money between so many different accounts and investments that even he probably didn't understand the complete picture. But there were also surprises. Linda's nursing salary had been substantial over the years, and if it had been properly invested instead of funding Richard's schemes, she would have been financially secure. My parents' original retirement planning had been excellent. They'd saved aggressively and made smart choices for decades before Richard convinced them to gamble it all away. The good news, I told them during our family meeting, is that the foundation was solid. The problem wasn't your financial skills, it was trusting someone whose skills were vastly overrated. The most difficult conversation was about the future of our relationships. Financial dependence creates its own dynamics, and I wanted to be clear about expectations before implementing any rescue plan. I'm not doing this to control you or punish you, I explained. I'm doing it because you're my family and I love you, but I'm also not going to pretend that nothing has changed. You can't go back to dismissing my judgment while depending on my resources. Linda was struggling with this new reality the most. So what does that mean for us? Are you going to be making all our decisions now? It means that when I offer advice about money or business, you need to listen. It means that when I suggest professional help or oversight, you need to accept it. It means acknowledging that the skills you've spent years dismissing are exactly the skills that are going to save you. The truth was uncomfortable but necessary. Our family had operated on false assumptions for so long that only complete honesty could create space for genuine healing. They needed to understand that their rescue wasn't just about money, it was about rebuilding relationships based on mutual respect rather than condescension and denial. The consequences of their choices were real and lasting, but so was my commitment to helping them build something better from the wreckage. The decision to establish the Chen Family Foundation wasn't just about helping my immediate family, it was about creating something that would outlast the immediate crises and serve as a symbol of what we could build together when ego and prejudice were set aside. I spent a week working with my legal team to structure the foundation properly. The goal was to provide genuine security while maintaining accountability and preventing future financial disasters. The foundation would own my parents' house, eliminating the foreclosure threat while ensuring they could live there for the rest of their lives. It would provide Linda with a steady income stream that couldn't be gambled away or invested foolishly. Most importantly, it would be managed by professional trustees who answered to me, not to the family members who'd proven incapable of managing money responsibly. The first board meeting was held in my company's conference room, a deliberate choice to reinforce the source of the resources they were depending on. Linda, my parents, and I sat around the same table where I'd made billion-dollar decisions, but the dynamic was completely different from any family gathering we'd ever had. Before we discussed the specifics of financial support, I began, I want everyone to understand what this foundation represents. It's not charity, it's an investment in our family's future, but investments require accountability. I distributed thick folders containing detailed financial plans for each family member. Linda's folder included a complete debt consolidation strategy, a realistic budget for sustainable living, and a career development plan that would help her rebuild professional credibility. Linda, your nursing skills are valuable, but your financial management skills need work. The foundation will pay for your return to school for healthcare administration. With proper training, you could be running a nursing department within 5 years? She looked surprised. You want me to go back to school? I want you to build something meaningful instead of just maintaining appearances. You're smart and capable, but you've been focused on looking successful rather than being successful. There's a difference. My parents' folder outlined a comprehensive retirement plan that would restore their financial security while providing clear guidelines for future decision-making. No major financial decisions without foundation approval. No investments beyond conservative, professionally managed portfolios. No loans or guarantees for family members without trustee oversight. "This feels like being put in financial prison," my father said after reviewing the restrictions. "No, Dad, this is what financial responsibility looks like when you've proven you can't handle it independently. You're free to make any choices you want with your monthly allowance, but you're not free to risk everyone's security again." The most difficult conversation was about Richard. His cooperation with federal investigators was proceeding, but the legal consequences would be substantial. More immediately, his marriage to Linda was in crisis, and his future role in the family was uncertain. "I can't include Richard in the foundation while he's facing criminal charges," I explained. "But Linda, if you choose to stay married to him, the foundation will pay for marriage counseling and financial therapy. If you choose to divorce him, it will pay for legal representation." Linda was quiet for a long moment. "What would you do?" "I can't make that decision for you. But I can tell you that rebuilding a marriage requires both people to acknowledge what went wrong and commit to genuine change. Richard's addiction isn't just about gambling, it's about honesty, responsibility, and respect for other people's trust." The foundation's mission statement, which I read aloud during that first meeting, was carefully crafted to honor both our family's past and its potential future. The Chen Family Foundation exists to provide security, opportunity, and support for family members who demonstrate commitment to honest communication, responsible decision-making, and mutual respect. The foundation recognizes that success is not about maintaining appearances or following traditional paths, but about making informed choices and taking responsibility for their consequences. It was a statement that would have been impossible to write 6 months earlier, when our family still operated on the assumption that Linda's practical choices and Richard's traditional expertise represented wisdom, while my unconventional career represented irresponsibility. The foundation meetings became monthly events, held in my office, where family members reported on their progress and made requests for support. Linda was excelling in her graduate program, discovering talents for leadership and organization she'd never had the opportunity to develop. My parents were adjusting to their new financial reality with more grace than I'd expected, finally free from the stress of trying to manage investments they'd never understood. Most importantly, the foundation was changing how we communicated as a family. Instead of pretending problems didn't exist or dismissing uncomfortable truths, we were learning to have honest conversations about money, relationships, and expectations. "You know what the strangest part is?" Linda said during one of our monthly meetings. "I feel more secure now than I did when Richard was making all those investment deals. I never really understood what we were investing in or why, but I was afraid to ask questions because I thought it would make me look stupid." Questions don't make you look stupid, Linda. Blind trust makes you look stupid. The choice of mercy over revenge had been the right one, but it wasn't simple kindness. It was strategic compassion, helping people become better while ensuring they couldn't make the same mistakes again. The foundation wasn't just about providing money, it was about providing structure, accountability, and the kind of support that helps people grow instead of just survive. For the first time in our family's history, success was being defined not by appearances or traditional markers, but by genuine growth, honest communication, and the wisdom to learn from mistakes. It was exactly the kind of practical success my parents had always claimed to value, built on exactly the kind of innovative thinking they'd spent years dismissing. 6 months after the foundation was established, our family dynamics had transformed in ways I'd never imagined possible. The monthly board meetings had evolved from tense financial discussions into genuine conversations about goals, challenges, and mutual support. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was part of a family that saw me clearly instead of through the distorted lens of their own insecurities. Linda's transformation was the most remarkable. Graduate school had awakened leadership skills she'd never known she possessed, and her professors were already suggesting she consider doctoral studies in healthcare administration. More importantly, she was learning to separate her self-worth from external appearances. I spent so much energy trying to look successful that I never learned how to actually be successful, she admitted during one of our meetings. Every decision I made was about what other people would think, not about what would actually work. Her marriage to Richard remained complicated. He was making progress in treatment and had begun the process of making restitution to his victims, but trust rebuilding was a slow process. Linda had decided to stay married, but maintain separate finances, a decision I fully supported. "I love him," she explained, "but I am never again going to let love make me stupid about money." My parents had embraced their new financial structure with surprising enthusiasm. Free from the anxiety of managing investments they'd never understood, they were rediscovering interests they'd set aside during their working years. My father had started teaching math to adult learners, while my mother was volunteering with literacy programs. We spent so many years worrying about money that we forgot to enjoy the life we were working so hard to protect, my mother said. "Now that someone else is handling the complicated stuff, we can focus on what actually matters." The most significant change was in how they talked about my career. Instead of dismissive comments about playing with computers, they'd started asking genuine questions about my work. They still didn't fully understand the technology, but they'd begun to appreciate the business skills and strategic thinking that had made my success possible. "I've been reading about your company in the business magazines," my father said with obvious pride. "The article in Forbes said you revolutionized how small businesses handle their operations." I never understood what that meant before. Our family gatherings had completely changed character. Instead of subtle competitions and defensive conversations, we were having substantive discussions about work, goals, and family plans. Linda no longer felt the need to prove her superiority, and my parents no longer felt obligated to offer unsolicited advice about my life choices. The foundation meetings themselves had become exercises in collaborative problem-solving. When Linda wanted to attend the conference in Chicago, we discussed the professional benefits and budget implications together. When my parents needed home repairs, we reviewed contractor bids and timeline options as a team. "This is what I always wanted family meetings to feel like," my mother observed. "Like we're all working together instead of everyone trying to prove they're right." The boundaries I'd established weren't punitive, they were protective. By taking control of major financial decisions, I'd freed everyone else from the pressure of pretending to expertise they didn't possess. By requiring transparency, I'd eliminated the secrecy that had allowed Richard's problems to metastasize. Most importantly, the new structure had created space for genuine respect to develop. No longer needed to diminish my achievements to maintain her own sense of worth. My parents no longer needed to defend their traditional values by attacking my unconventional choices. The Foundation's first annual report, which I presented to the family that spring, showed remarkable progress. Linda's career development was ahead of schedule. My parents' health and well-being had improved significantly once financial stress was eliminated. Even Richard, though still dealing with legal consequences, was making genuine progress toward recovery. "What strikes me most," I said during that presentation, "is how much more capable everyone has become when they're not trying to manage areas outside their expertise. Linda's natural leadership is flourishing in healthcare. Mom and Dad are finding meaningful ways to contribute to their community. Everyone's strengths are being utilized instead of everyone pretending to strengths they don't have." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Linda spoke up. "Marcus, I owe you an apology that's bigger than anything I said at my birthday party. I spent years being jealous of your freedom to pursue unconventional goals. But instead of admitting that jealousy, I convinced myself that my traditional choices were superior. I made you feel small because I felt small." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me, and it opened the door for the kind of conversation we'd never been able to have before. "I understand why you felt that way," I replied. "Our parents taught us that there was one right way to be successful, and when I chose a different way, it threatened that certainty. But the truth is, there are many ways to be successful, and the best families support each other's different paths instead of insisting everyone follow the same one." The transformation wasn't complete. Family dynamics take years to fully change, but the foundation had been laid for relationships based on mutual respect rather than competition and insecurity. We were finally becoming the family we'd always had the potential to be. 1 year after the foundation was established, Linda surprised me with a handwritten letter that arrived at my office on a Tuesday morning. I almost didn't recognize her handwriting. It had been years since anyone in my family had written me a personal letter rather than sending a quick text or email. "Dear Marcus," it began, "I've been thinking about this letter for months, trying to find the right words to express something that feels too big for casual conversation." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her journey from the denial and anger that followed her birthday party, revelation to a growing understanding of how family dynamics had shaped all of our choices over the years. But the part that moved me most was her reflection on what she'd learned about herself. "I realized that my need to be seen as the successful sibling wasn't really about you at all," she wrote. "It was about my own fear that I wasn't smart enough or creative enough to succeed in unconventional ways. Putting you down was easier than admitting I was envious of your courage to build something entirely new." She'd completed her master's degree in healthcare administration and had been offered a department leadership position at the hospital where she'd worked for over a decade. The promotion represented not just career advancement, but genuine recognition of skills she'd developed through hard work rather than family connections or financial maneuvering. "For the first time in my professional life, I feel like I'm succeeding because of my abilities rather than despite my limitations," her letter continued. "The foundation gave me the security to take risks, to invest in real skills instead of just trying to maintain appearances." Linda's marriage to Richard had stabilized in an unexpected way. Rather than trying to return to their previous dynamic, they had built something entirely new based on honesty about their individual limitations and strengths. Richard was working as a financial counselor for people recovering from gambling addiction, using his experience with failure to help others avoid similar mistakes. "We'll never have the kind of marriage we thought we wanted," Linda told me during one of our conversations, "but we might have the kind of marriage that actually works. We know too much about each other's weaknesses to pretend they don't exist, but we also know that people can change if they're willing to do the work." My parents had embraced their new role as financially secure retirees with surprising creativity. Free from the stress of managing money they didn't understand, they'd discovered energy for pursuits they'd set aside for decades. My father's tutoring program had grown into a small nonprofit serving adult learners throughout the county, while my mother had become a sought-after volunteer coordinator for several literacy organizations. The irony isn't lost on me, my father said during one of our family dinners. I spent your childhood telling you that grades don't pay bills, and now I'm spending my retirement helping people improve their education. Maybe I was wrong about the relationship between learning and practical success. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from him, and it was enough. His work with adult learners had given him a new appreciation for the value of unconventional thinking and innovative approaches to persistent problems. The most significant change was in how our family handled conflict and disagreement. Instead of the old pattern of dismissal and defensiveness, we'd learned to disagree respectfully and seek solutions collaboratively. When Linda and I had different opinions about foundation priorities, we debated the merits of our positions rather than questioning each other's competence or motives. We're finally having the kinds of conversations I always hoped we'd have, my mother observed, like a family of adults who respect each other instead of a family of people trying to prove who's the most adult. The foundation's work had expanded beyond our immediate family. We'd begun providing scholarships for adult learners returning to school, grants for small business development in underserved communities, and support for programs that helped families recover from financial crises. It felt good to use our family's painful experience to help others avoid similar struggles. Richard's recovery remained a work in progress, but his commitment to making amends was genuine. He'd testified in several criminal cases involving financial fraud, helping prosecutors understand the psychology and methods of investment scams. His cooperation had resulted in reduced charges, but more importantly, it had given him a sense of purpose beyond his own recovery. I can't undo what I did to your family, he told me during one of our rare private conversations. But I can help other families avoid going through what you went through. It doesn't make us even, but it's something. The transformation wasn't just about individual growth, it was about collective healing. We'd learned to see each other clearly instead of through the lens of old resentments and insecurities. We'd developed the ability to support each other's different paths instead of insisting everyone followed the same route to success. Most importantly, we'd created a family culture where innovation and tradition could coexist, where different types of intelligence were valued, and where success was measured by personal growth and contribution rather than by appearances or conventional markers. The boy who'd been dismissed as a dreamer had grown into a man who'd taught his family that some dreams are worth pursuing, even when the path is uncertain. And the family that had once felt threatened by unconventional choices had learned that supporting each other's different strengths made everyone more successful. 2 years after that catastrophic birthday party, I found myself standing in the same garage where I'd started my company 15 years earlier. The space had been converted into a workshop for neighborhood kids interested in technology, part of a community program the foundation had launched to support young innovators who might not fit traditional educational models. The garage looked different now, clean, organized, filled with modern equipment and eager young faces. But the energy was the same sense of possibility, the same excitement about building something that didn't exist yet, the same willingness to work long hours on projects that other people might dismiss as impractical. Mr. Chen, can you help me with this coding problem? Asked Maria, a 14-year-old whose unconventional thinking reminded me of myself at that age. She was working on an app to help elderly people manage their medications. Inspired by her grandmother's struggles with complex prescription schedules, as I helped her debug her code, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The boy who'd been told his dreams were impractical was now teaching other dreamers that their ideas might change the world. The family failure had become a family foundation, literally and figuratively. My company's mission statement had evolved over the years, but its core purpose remained the same: making powerful technology accessible to people who'd been overlooked by traditional systems. We'd grown from a garage startup to a Fortune 500 company by focusing on users who'd been dismissed as too small, too unsophisticated, or too unconventional for mainstream solutions. That philosophy had shaped the foundation's work as well. We supported adult learners who'd been written off by traditional education systems, small businesses that banks considered too risky, and families recovering from financial crises that other organizations saw as hopeless cases. You know what I've learned from watching your family's transformation? My assistant Saratha, Sarah Martinez, who'd made that first life-changing phone call years earlier, said during one of our planning meetings. Success isn't about proving you're better than other people. It's about helping other people become better than they thought they could be. She was right. The most satisfying part of my journey hadn't been the Fortune 500 recognition or the financial success. It had been watching my family members discover capabilities they'd never known they possessed when they stopped competing with each other and started supporting each other. Linda had been promoted again, and was now being recruited by major hospital systems looking for innovative leadership. My parents had established a small scholarship fund for adult learners, using their own modest savings to help people who reminded them of themselves at younger ages. Even Richard had found a way to transform his failures into service, helping other families recognize and address financial problems before they became crises. Our family gatherings had become something I actually looked forward to. Instead of dreading questions about my work or deflecting criticism of my choices, I enjoyed sharing updates about company developments and hearing about everyone else's projects and goals. We learned to celebrate each other's successes instead of treating them as threats to our own sense of worth. I've been thinking about what we should put in our family history for future generations. My mother said during our most recent gathering, "What do we want them to know about what we learned?" It was a good question. What had we learned that was worth passing on? We'd learned that dismissing someone's dreams doesn't protect them from failure. It protects you from having to acknowledge that your own path isn't the only valid one. We'd learned that true security comes from developing genuine capabilities, not from maintaining appearances. We'd learned that families work best when different types of intelligence are valued, and different paths to success are supported. Importantly, we'd learned that it's never too late to choose growth over stagnation, honesty over defensiveness, and collaboration over competition. The Foundation's work continued to expand, but its core mission remained personal, helping people who'd been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated discover their own potential for success. Every scholarship we provided, every small business we supported, every family we helped recover from financial crisis was a reminder that success comes in many forms, and that the most innovative solutions often come from the most unexpected places. Standing in that garage, watching young innovators work on projects their teachers might not understand, I realized that my journey had come full circle. The boy who'd been told his dreams were impractical had grown into a man whose job was encouraging other people to dream bigger. My sister had called me a failure, but failure and success aren't permanent, states they're temporary conditions that change based on persistence, learning, and the willingness to keep building even when other people don't understand what you're trying to create. The Fortune 500 list had validated my success in the eyes of the world, but the real validation came from knowing that the skills and resources I'd developed were being used to help other people build better lives for themselves and their families. That's a legacy worth building, whether people understand it at first or not.